Have you ever been laughed at by your own family for giving $100 to someone in need without them realizing you control the millions they live off of? The truth is, I was erased from my family's will at 26. They thought I was powerless. What they didn't know was that I'd quietly built a digital architecture that funded their lifestyle, and I could freeze it with one click. I'm Seline Carter, founder of Shellcode Holdings, the backbone behind over 300 million in global trust traffic. In this video, I'll show you how I turn silence into strategy and reclaim my power without raising my voice. If you've ever been underestimated, excluded, or made to feel like less, this story is your blueprint to take back control. I used to sip peppermint tea alone in a cold apartment. Now, I oversee the finances of people who once dismissed me. Don't skip this video, because if you've ever felt erased, this might just help you rewrite your story. Before we dive into the story, let me learn a bit about you. If you're a charming lady, please leave the number 1 in the comments. And if you're a dashing gentleman, leave the number 2. This way, I can send you a special greeting. Now, let's start the story together. They laughed at me over $100. Without realizing they were living off millions I controlled. The cold snap had arrived early in Cincinnati that November, the kind that turned your breath solid before it left your mouth and left the sidewalks slick with a quiet threat. I had my wine-colored scarf wrapped twice around my neck as I crossed the street to Mrs. Hutchkins' porch. She stood in the doorway in mismatched slippers, clutching a grocery flyer like it might offer her heat. She didn't ask for help. She never did. That was the thing about women like her. Dignity hung on like an old coat, worn, patched, but stubbornly intact. So when I handed her a crisp $100 bill, she blinked once, then nodded. "I'll pay you back on the 3rd, she whispered. "You won't," I replied, smiling and tucked it into her cardigan pocket. "But I appreciate the thought." I walked back to my apartment, fingers tingling more from something unspoken than the cold. I made peppermint tea and let the steam carry away the sound of her front door closing. That tea always reminded me of my grandfather. He used to say it cleared the noise of the world so you could hear what mattered underneath. He also once said, "Kindness pays you back in silence first and power later." I didn't understand it back then. I do now. My parents' house looked like a catalog shoot that had overdosed on garland. Wreaths hung in every window, candles lit in perfect symmetry, and the banister was wrapped in a forest of tinsel. Dinner was roasted Cornish hen, truffle potatoes, and a performance. We were 8 at the table. My parents, some family friends from their country club, and a couple I didn't know but who had clearly been told what kind of impression to leave. I sat between 2 chairs that once belonged to my childhood. Same upholstery, different rules. The conversation was crisp, polished. My father talked about their recent trip to Nantucket. My mother praised a gallery she never liked, but whose owner donated to her nonprofit. The wine flowed. So did the small talk. I said little, as usual. I'd learned that my silence made them more comfortable and more careless. Then it came. Helen leaned forward, one manicured hand holding her wine glass delicately, and said with a laugh that slid too easily into cruelty, "So, we heard you gave poor Mrs. Hutchkins $100 this morning. Still giving out charity like you're Mother Teresa of 4th Street?" The table laughed. Russell, Dad, added with a chuckle, "Good thing you don't have much to give, huh? Otherwise you'd probably try to solve poverty one grocery bag at a time." Laughter again. Soft but sharp like paper cuts. I didn't flinch. I smiled, reached for my napkin and folded it carefully, corner to corner like origami. Then I set it beside my untouched dessert and stood. "Excuse me," I said, my voice calm. "I promised Carmen I'd check in before she logs off." There was a pause. Carmen was my assistant. They knew that. They just hadn't known I still had one. Outside, the night had deepened. The Carter household's front lawn looked like a snow globe, perfect, sterile, sealed. Back at my apartment, I didn't turn on the lights right away. I slipped out of my coat and scarf, let the warmth of the heater hum through the walls, and sat at my kitchen counter with the peppermint tea still faintly warm in its mug. Then I opened my laptop. The screen blinked to life with a familiar, quiet glow. I navigated through encrypted layers, past facial recognition, and opened a portal most people didn't know existed. Certainly not Helen and Russell Carter. Shell Code Holdings. The name sounded like an LLC buried in Nevada or Delaware, which it was. But behind that name lived a network of trusts, retirement accounts, and high-yield liquid funds, each branching off into allocations, health insurance premiums, property taxes, travel reimbursements. I created it when I was 26, the year I realized I was better at managing money than people. My parents had never asked where their supplemental fund came from. They assumed it was some legacy pipeline from my grandfather or a remnant of Russell's short-lived financial advising years. They never thought to ask who held the master key. I stared at the number on the screen. Available balance, $3,578,212.47. $3,578,000 and 47 cents if anyone cared. Enough to cushion their retirements, their trips, their antique purchases, enough to keep them laughing over wine. My mouse hovered over the revoke access button. One click and the mortgage would default. One click and the travel card would stop working mid-flight. One click and they'd find out just how generous I'd been all these years. I didn't click. Not that night. I just sat there, peppermint rising into the air, laptop casting blue shadows across my table. Because here's the thing, I didn't freeze their lifestyle that night. I just realized I could. They erased me from the will, but not from the code. The apartment was quiet again, save for the faint rattle of the radiator and the soft hum of my laptop. Peppermint steam curled from the mug beside me, half forgotten, the same as last night. On the floor, tucked beneath a stack of old design journals and file folders, sat a rusted tin box. Inside, wrapped in flannel like a fragile heirloom, was the blue savings book. My grandfather's handwriting still lined the inside flap, looped and faded. Arizona, 2011. I was 21, sitting cross-legged on a porch swing that creaked like it had secrets. The red dust clung to my jeans and eyebrows. Grandfather Arthur, tall, quiet, always dressed like he'd just stepped off a steam engine, pressed the book into my hands like it was a compass. "You don't have to prove anything to them," he said, eyes narrowed at the far hills. "Just build." That one word changed the way I lived. Build. It was why I didn't break when my parents invited me to brunch in late 2018 and informed me, in voices so soft they almost passed for kind, that I had been left out of the estate. "Sweetheart," my mother said, smoothing her silk blouse with unnecessary precision, "this isn't about punishment. It's about simplicity. We don't want to burden you." Russell, ever the polite financier, added, "You're doing fine on your own, aren't you?" I remember the way my teacup clinked when I set it down. No anger, no rebuttal. I just nodded and said I had to catch a flight back to the ranch. What they didn't know was that I wasn't fine. I was furious. But fury doesn't build. Focus does. The ranch was in Sedona, nestled between dry hills and overworked routers. It was half coding residency, half goat guarding internship. I spent mornings feeding animals and evenings debugging algorithms in a refurbished barn. I slept on a cot beside a space heater, wrote shell scripts under the stars, and drank more black coffee than any sane body should. That's where I met R.A. No last name, no questions. They were already building firewall overlays for hedge fund clients and looking for someone with a quiet brain and loud ethics. We clicked, not loudly, but with the finality of a sealed door. Shellcode 7 began as a joke, a ghost architecture that could bury infrastructure beneath infrastructure, layered anonymity for people too rich to trust banks and too smart to get caught. It took us 8 months to design it. By the time we launched, we had 4 clients, all billionaires, and 0 branding. Meanwhile, Arthur had quietly transferred a separate trust into a back-end protocol I had coded with RA. No names, no paper trails, no family lawyers. He called it just in case. By the time he passed, I was the only one who knew it existed. So when my parents said I was out, I was already in, deeper than they could imagine. Back in the present, I stared at my screen. Carmen's text had popped up at 6:02 a.m. Check Vera Carter Private Holdings. Something's off. Vera, my sister, the golden one. I hadn't heard her voice in 9 months, since the wedding I wasn't invited to but still ended up paying for indirectly via a health insurance routing adjustment I hadn't caught in time. Shellcode had flagged her name. Apparently, Vera had recently onboarded Shellcode 7 as a client, through her bank. She used my name on the paperwork. At first, I thought it was a joke. Then I saw the signature. My signature. Digital. Perfect. And absolutely not mine. I opened the metadata, SSL mismatch, timing discrepancy. Carmen called before I could text back. Her face flickered onto the screen, red sweater, hair in a loose bun. She looked tired but sharp. I ran a validation checksum, she said, skipping pleasantries. The signature was generated using a cloned private key. Likely someone accessed the backup server through Vera's branch. Could have only happened with in-house approval. So she forged it. She, or someone close to her, but the audit trail points straight to her terminal. My throat felt dry, not angry, not even surprised, just disappointed. She took what she assumed was hers, I said quietly. But it wasn't. It never was. Carmen didn't say anything for a moment. Then softly, "Do you want me to disable the account?" Dear friend, what would you do if you were in my shoes? I bet you can't guess what's coming next. But before we go any further, drop a 5 in the comments if you're still with me, because what happens next might just leave you speechless. I shook my head. No, I want to see what she does with it. I pulled up the dashboard and activated monitoring mode. It wouldn't freeze the account, just mirror every transaction in real time and send hourly logs to a secured offshore database. If she moved so much as $1, I'd know. I reached under the desk and took out the tin box. For a moment, I just held it in my lap. The blue savings book peeked out, edges curled with time. I flipped to the page where Arthur had written a final balance, $4,200.23, and a note in pencil. Don't waste time proving, just protect. I placed the book back carefully, closed the lid, and slid it away. I wasn't erased. I was encoded. The scent hit me first, eucalyptus and cold marble, the smell of banks that weren't built for people like me. Crescent's downtown branch looked more like a museum than a place for money. Glossy floors without a single scuff, quiet hums of climate control, and glass walls that showed everything but let no sound escape. My boots tapped a little too loudly as I crossed the polished entrance. I hadn't stepped foot inside this place in years. Not since they gave Vera the corner office. Not since the family stopped pretending we had anything in common. A receptionist smiled without warmth. "Can I help you?" "Yes," I said. "I'd like to make a small withdrawal from my holding account. Name's Seline Carter." Her fingers paused over the keyboard. She wasn't used to names like mine showing up alone, apparently. "One moment," she said. Her voice clipped and smooth, like the customer service equivalent of a glass of flat soda. Footsteps clicked against the tile. Then her voice, precise, polished, and far too loud. "Seline, we don't usually take walk-ins at this branch," Vera called across the lobby, her tone just saccharine enough to be sharp. I turned. There she was, Vera Carter, my older sister. Her blazer was dove gray, her heels looked brand new, and her makeup had that expensive, unbothered glow. She walked toward me like she owned the building, and maybe in her mind she did. "We cater to appointment holders, private clients," she added, "not beggars." Every conversation stopped. I felt the receptionist's shift in posture. A man near the teller window glanced over his shoulder. Even the security guard blinked like he wasn't sure he'd heard right. I didn't flinch. Just like the peppermint tea I brewed every evening, my calm came from muscle memory. I looked her square in the eye, offered a nod that meant absolutely nothing, and walked out. The doors hissed softly behind me. Outside, the winter air bit through the seams of my coat, but I didn't rush. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the wine-colored scarf, my quiet reminder that dignity isn't loud. I wrapped it slowly around my neck, fingers brushing against the knit pattern like I was pressing the edges of a wound. Years ago, at a Christmas party in our parents' home, Vera had pulled me aside while everyone else sang around the piano. She was already working at Crescent back then, just an assistant branch manager, but you'd think she'd bought the bank herself. I'd just been offered an internship with a tiny cybersecurity startup in Arizona. Nothing glamorous, but promising. Vera, drink in hand, had leaned in and smiled with that same sharp tilt to her lips. "Maybe aim lower, Seline," she'd said, loud enough for our cousin to hear. "The world doesn't owe you a corner office." That was the thing about Vera. She always smiled when she cut you. Back in the present, I stared at the Crescent Bank confirmation screen. Executive access meant I could walk in through the back elevators, past the marble, the eucalyptus, the judgment, past Vera's kingdom. Carmen's message blinked onto my screen. "You okay?" I typed back. "Not angry, just ready." I moved slowly, placing the wine-colored scarf carefully on my desk, smoothing it like a page in a book I knew by heart. Then I opened a secure window, checked the latest API logs. Vera's branch hadn't flagged the forged signature from earlier. That meant either she didn't know, or she did, and thought no one would trace it. Both options told me the same thing. She underestimated me. They all did. My tea had gone cold again, but I sipped it anyway. Outside my window, Crescent's tower glowed with artificial warmth. People walked in and out like it was just another building, unaware that upstairs, a digital audit had already begun counting the seconds. I wasn't here to make noise. I was here to change the locks. As I walked down the steps from the bank, a gust of wind sliced between the buildings and caught the edge of my scarf, flapping it against my cheek like a soft reminder. I still had breath. The city around me didn't care what just happened. A delivery truck rumbled by. Someone shouted across the street about coffee. Life was indifferent but not cruel. It just kept going. Each step toward the subway felt deliberate. I wasn't retreating, I was recalibrating. When I opened the door to my apartment, the familiar scent of cinnamon and fabric softener greeted me. My small sofa, worn but clean, faced the same bookshelf I'd had since college. Above it, a photo of my grandfather at the ranch, squinting into the Arizona sun. He looked right at home in a world that didn't expect apologies. My phone buzzed again. Carmen. "Want me to flag Vera's branch for manual review?" Me. "Not yet, let's just watch." Carmen. "Copy that. Watching is our specialty." I smiled. Carmen didn't ask questions. She knew this wasn't about revenge. This was about recovery. My hands hovered over the keyboard one more time. I clicked to enable a passive audit on any Crescent branch transfer above $10,000. Nothing flashy, just accountability. Then I sat back and listened to the hum of my apartment, the radiator clicking on, a kettle whistling on the stove, my pulse finally settling into something steady. The bank hadn't broken me. They'd just reminded me who I was. I arrived without an appointment. I didn't need one. The moment I stepped into the lobby of Crescent Bank's regional headquarters, the receptionist straightened up a little too quickly. Her eyes flicked to the screen, then back to me. There was a pause, a hesitation, as if the software had just whispered a secret she wasn't sure she was supposed to know. "Ms. Carter," she said, recovering. "The executive floor is expecting you." The elevator hummed quietly as it rose to the 24th floor. I didn't touch the wine-colored scarf today. I left it on the hook by my front door, like a charm I no longer needed. My coat was sharply tailored. My boots clicked with confidence. For years, I had kept myself muted in their presence. Too polite, too quiet, too considerate. Today, the silence was still mine. But it wasn't weakness. It was precision. The boardroom was glass on 3 sides. The Cincinnati skyline stretched like a paused animation outside, gray, winter and heavy, motionless. Inside, it was all white leather, cold chrome, and a table that cost more than some people's cars. Vera was already seated at the head. Her blazer was coral today, loud and carefully fitted. Her hair was done in that too-tight twist she wore when she was trying to prove something. She didn't stand. "You're early," she said. A brittle smile stretched too thin. "You're unqualified," I replied, sitting opposite her. Her smirk faltered. Behind me, 2 men entered, mid-40s, plain suits, nondescript briefcases, shell code auditors. I'd requested the 2 most anonymous professionals possible. I wanted the records to speak louder than anyone in the room. The taller of the 2 nodded to Vera. "We're here to address discrepancies related to unauthorized client onboarding at this branch." "I wasn't aware this meeting would be formal," Vera said quickly, glancing around. "There's a process. There are steps." "There were," I said. "You skipped them." The second auditor opened a folder, slid a printed PDF across the table. My signature gleamed faintly from the page, elegant, digital, and completely fabricated. "This was submitted 3 weeks ago," the auditor said, "authorizing client access under a known corporate identity, shell code 7. It triggered back-end protocol alerts, particularly because Ms. Seline Carter's biometric encryption is attached to this trust, and she never signed this." Vera's eyes darted across the page. "There must be some mistake. The account was flagged urgent. The system—" "You assumed wrong," I cut in, "or you counted on no one noticing." She shifted in her seat. "Why would I forge anything? That's a serious accusation." I tapped once on the table. A small monitor behind me came to life, displaying transaction logs from the last 10 days. Expense routing, consulting charges, onboarding bonuses, each line tied to Vera's employee ID. The room turned quiet. The only sound was the low buzz of air vents and the barely audible clicking of Vera's fingers against her coffee cup. "Do you know what this system is?" I asked. Vera's voice was tight. "It's your little tech play. It's the invisible spine of 5 hedge funds and 3 real estate conglomerates. It handles over 300 million in digital trust traffic annually. You think we don't notice anomalies?" She opened her mouth, closed it again. I turned to the taller auditor. Her access, revoked as of 15 minutes ago. Notifications sent to compliance, HR, and state licensing board. That's when her voice broke. Wait, you don't have to do this. We can talk. We're family." I stood. "You laughed in my face last week, called me a beggar, in a building I helped fund. Now you want to talk?" "I didn't mean it like that," she whispered. I nodded toward the security guard by the door, who stepped forward without a word. Vera stood up, panic breaking through the seams of her poise. "You can't just walk in here and—" "I didn't walk in. I was escorted up." My tone was cool. "You're the walk-in now." When the guard gently placed a hand on her arm, Vera yanked away and turned to me, eyes wide and desperate. "You don't understand. I had no choice. Mom and Dad needed—" I raised one hand, not to silence her, just to stop the noise from taking up more space than it deserved. "You lived off millions I never owed you. Consider this the refund." And then she grabbed my wrist, not hard, just enough to feel the cold of her fingers and the warmth of her breath rising in frantic puffs. Her mouth opened, but nothing came out. The guard hesitated. I looked at him. "Wait." I turned back to Vera. Her eyes were glassy, rimmed with disbelief. Her grip loosened. "This isn't revenge, Vera," I said. "This is accountability." She dropped to her knees. The guard didn't touch her. He didn't need to. She just fell. Silence filled the room. Not the kind that demanded to be broken, the kind that settled like a final period at the end of a sentence that had gone on too long. The auditors gathered their documents. One gave me a slight nod. The monitor went dark. I walked out without looking back. As the elevator descended, I felt no adrenaline, no satisfaction, just a soft release, like tension slipping out of a muscle I hadn't realized was clenched. The scarf was still waiting for me at home, but I didn't think I'd need it again. I didn't touch her. I didn't need to. The system had already deleted her. They set the table like nothing happened. The same ivory china edged with gold, the same cloth napkins folded like swans, the same roast chicken resting proudly at the center, still steaming, still untouched. I recognized it all. But this time, I didn't sit down to play my part. The house smelled like rosemary and varnished floors. My parents had gone all out. Helen's earrings sparkled even from across the room. Russell wore the same navy sweater he pulled out for every family occasion. And Vera sat stiff and pale at the far end, her fork unmoved. "Look who finally joined us," my mother said sweetly, the corners of her mouth fighting not to tremble. "We were starting to think you got lost." "I never get lost," I replied evenly, slipping out of my coat and placing a manila folder next to the bread basket. I didn't take off my scarf. My uncles offered polite nods. My aunt raised her glass as if rehearsed. Everyone else acted like this was just a regular Carter family dinner. We passed around mashed potatoes. Someone made a joke about the weather, but no one reached for the folder. After the first round of toasts, Russell's usual to family, to tradition, I cleared my throat and stood. "I won't take long," I began, tapping the folder lightly. "I just thought it was time we all read from the same page." Helen blinked, her hand stilling over her wine glass. Russell kept chewing, eyes fixed on his plate. Vera didn't move. I opened the folder and began laying out the documents, one by one. Slow, deliberate, calm. "This," I said, placing the first page forward, "is the deed transfer for the Crescent property, signed over in full by Grandpa Arthur into a trust managed under Shell Code Holdings." My father's brow twitched. "This one," I continued, "is the routing history for the Carter Family Health Fund. You'll see the withdrawals started aligning with Vera's vacations in 2019. Vera's eyes closed briefly. "And this," I laid down the final page, "is the authorization form for Shell Code onboarding. My signature, forged." Silence. Even the clinking of silverware had stopped. Helen reached for her tea, but the cup wobbled in the saucer. "You had no right," Russell finally said, his voice tight. "This wasn't meant to go public." "Neither was the fraud," I replied. I looked around the table at the faces I once tried to please, the ones that laughed at my silence, my thrift store boots, my so-called charity. I adjusted my scarf. "No one here has to finish dinner," I said, "but I'll be sending everyone a copy of the full audit, including the IRS." Helen gasped. I turned to the server, who stood frozen near the entrance. "Separate checks," I told him gently. "No one eats off me again." Russell slammed his fist on the table, rattling the silverware. "You think you're above this family?" I looked him in the eye. "No, I think I'm finally beside it, on my own terms." The room stayed still. Vera didn't speak. My uncle stared down at their untouched plates. Helen dabbed her eyes, but no tears came. Behind me, the roast chicken sat perfectly browned, perfectly glazed, but no one touched it, not a bite. I walked out without looking back. The door clicked shut behind me like punctuation at the end of a sentence I had waited years to write. Outside, the wind had picked up, biting through my coat, but it didn't feel cold. Not really. There's a strange warmth that comes when you stop asking permission to be seen. I sat in my car for a moment, watching the reflection of the house in the rearview mirror. The golden light still glowed. Behind those curtains, they were probably whispering, parsing every word I said. Or maybe they were finally silent. The kind that comes after a storm no one admits was weathered. I reached into the glove box and pulled out the blue savings book. its cover worn, the corners soft from years of shifting between drawers and boxes. My grandfather's handwriting still stood out on the first page, faded but firm. "You don't have to prove anything to them," he had said once, placing it in my hands. "Just build." And I had. Quietly. Completely. Back at home, I boiled water for peppermint tea and unwrapped the scarf, folding it neatly on the edge of the sofa. For once, I didn't need it. My armor was no longer cloth. It was memory, foresight, and the kind of clarity that can't be bought at any bank. I opened my laptop and refreshed the access logs. Dozens of attempts. Denied. Frozen accounts. Red flags. Escalations queued. It wasn't revenge. It was reclamation. I had given them years of silence, of grace. They chose to ignore that generosity, mistake it for weakness. But power, real power, often looks like stillness until it moves. And when it does, it rewrites the dinner table, the chairs, the seating, the menu, the bill. I took a long sip of tea and stared out the window, not at the city, not at the skyline, but at my own reflection, finally centered in the frame. The next morning, Carmen texted, "You okay?" I typed and deleted 3 responses before settling on the truth. I am now. There were still audits to finalize, names to flag, a legacy to rebuild, but the part that scared me the most had already happened. I showed up. I said it out loud, and no one could unhear it. That folder was never meant to humiliate. It was meant to liberate. Because sometimes, the most radical thing you can do is stop pretending the meal is worth the price of your dignity. Let them keep the roast chicken, the gold trim, the curated grace. I had something better. My name, my voice, and the full power of what they dismissed. The Carter family legacy wasn't theirs to erase. It was mine to reclaim. The morning light slid across my new desk like it knew where I'd been. No clutter, no noise, just the quiet hum of a fresh start. Carmen stood at the door, holding a small white box and smiling wider than I'd ever seen her. "We're officially filed," she said. "Welcome to the world, Elevate Fund." I nodded, letting the words settle. Not like confetti, but like foundation. Solid. Final. A name I chose without asking permission. A name that now lived in legal ink, with accounts and bylaws and a mission to fund first-generation entrepreneurs. People like me, like the ones the world didn't expect to make it past the door. The kettle clicked off. Peppermint steam curled into the February air. I poured slowly, careful not to spill, like the ritual itself held meaning beyond taste. Maybe it did. I sat, tea in hand, when Carmen placed a cream-colored envelope beside the mug. "No return address," she said, but I recognized the handwriting. So did I. Helen's cursive had always looked more like calligraphy than communication. Every loop too perfect, every line more about presentation than feeling. I let it sit there for a moment, untouched. Carmen lingered by the bookshelf, pretending to straighten the spines. She didn't push. When I finally opened the envelope, the paper crackled like it resisted being read. Her words were brief. "Don't become what hurt you." That was it. No dear, no apology, no warmth. Just those 6 words like a command masquerading as advice. I folded it once, then again, and tucked it into the drawer where I'd stored the old blue savings book. I hadn't opened it in years, not since Arizona, when my grandfather pressed it into my hand and said, "Use it when they forget who you are." But I hadn't forgotten. Not really. Still, I flipped it open. Most of the pages were blank, but at the back, behind a faded bank logo and a worn corner, there was a note I'd never noticed before. Arthur's handwriting, faint but steady. And when you forget, too. I leaned back in the chair, holding the book like it might speak again. My eyes burned. Not with anger, not even grief, just memory. And something softer than either. Recognition. I let the tears come. Not many, just enough. Outside the floor-to-ceiling window, a sparrow landed on the ledge. It looked around, feathers fluffed against the cold, then hopped twice and flew off, like it had somewhere better to be. Carmen brought over a new client folder. "You ready for the first pitch session?" I smiled and closed the drawer. Yes. There was no parade, no dramatic walkout, just a chair, a desk, and a nameplate that read, Seline Carter, founder. Helen could keep her dinners. Vera could keep her silence. Russell could keep his old-fashioned pride. I had reclaimed something more permanent. I didn't need revenge. I needed clarity. And now I had it. There is a kind of peace that comes not from being seen, but from no longer needing to be. I sipped the tea. It had cooled, but the peppermint lingered. I didn't win. I just remembered I'd never needed to lose. I sat with the peppermint tea cooling in my hands, watching the bird disappear into the morning sky. No raised voices, no slammed doors, just a quiet ending to a long silence I no longer needed to carry. Sometimes the real power isn't in proving you were right, but in choosing peace over permission. Family doesn't always mean fairiness, and forgiveness doesn't always mean returning. But clarity? That's a freedom worth keeping. If this story reminded you of something you've lived through or are still healing from, I invite you to share your thoughts. Your voice matters, and someone out there might need to hear it.